I think what we were talking about was sort of how rational her arguments really were and how compelling they were to make you want to commit to being a vegetarian. And I think we had a little bit of disagreement on it, but for me personally, I really didn't find her arguments to be very compelling at all. But I wondered whether that was kind of the point.
You don't find them compelling?
I
do?
Don't find them very compelling. And I had a lot of sort of criticism with some of the things she was saying, and it just didn't make me want to be a vegetarian, really. It made me think a lot, but it wasn't compelling for me. But I wondered then, and I think we kind of agree that, was that sort of the point being that her reasoning behind being a vegetarian was a much more almost irrational, intuitive kind of feeling that she had, an emotional reaction, as opposed to a rational argumentation that she sort of came up with through, I don't know, deductive reasoning or some kind of rational technique. And I know we were only supposed to talk about the first section, but I think the last sort of sections really show that it was more of for me anyway, it was more of an intuitive response to something that she didn't quite understand, in a sense. She didn't quite understand why she felt this way. And for that reason, her argumentation for me wasn't very compelling, I guess you could say. I don't know what everyone else thought.
Would anybody like to follow up on that? Because we can just pass the microphone. Yeah.
I'm not sure if Elizabeth's sole purpose was to convince people not to be vegetarians. I think at some point someone asks very strongly, so what's the purpose of your lecture? Can you clarify? Can you summarize? And I think she refuses to do so. So I think what she's trying to do is to invite us think, feel, and imagine. So definitely within that is think about being a vegetarian, but my feeling from the reading is that it goes beyond that.
I found Alison's point very interesting because I find it opposite. Yeah, I'm a vegetarian, and then I think it doesn't matter if I'm a vegetarian or not so much here, but it was very her speech, her idea was very you said confounding. No. You said it was. It wasn't compelling. Compelling.
Yes.
Yeah, it wasn't compelling, but it was compelling for me because yes, what I understood is that she is saying whether or not you eat meat or not is not the issue of ethics. Well, in the sense that the ethics which defines right or wrong, but it's something prior to or beyond it. So it's more about rightness to me or to her. So yes, so that makes quite much of sense to me. Well, it's not like again, it's not about right or wrong, but different feeling. Yeah.
I think Costello wants to remove the block that the human rationality gives us, and she is not intending any kind of result, and I think he sees the problem is the rationality, the rationality of human somehow blocks our feeling, our empathy to other living beings, and he wanted to remove it. That's the only thing she wants to do. That's all.
In our table we discussed, actually we started from the question, what is it like to be a bat? And we discussed a lot about what you've been suggesting about the so-called rationality of the human, and to what degree that rationality can understand what it's like to be a bat. And then we engaged in a long dialogue about the separation or the tension between mind and body. And then we also had other words coming up like wholeness or consciousness. And then we thought that the whole question and the whole purpose, if there is a purpose in this text, is to raise the question of being. If I'm making any sense.
Can you say what's meant by the question of being? Say a bit more about that.
So we discussed what is it to be as a being for animals and for us. Because we started by saying that first of all, as humans we have a difficulty in understanding the bad because it's two different experiences. Our perception is subjective, and our rationality, as Nagel himself says, is very limited in our resources. So the first thing we said was that our rationality does not actually help us to understand. And then we raised the question, can we understand? And if we can, how? How can we understand?
I think most of you came to the lecture on Wednesday night, the philosophy seminar on Wednesday night, when the speaker was talking about Coetzee in relation to Nagel. And one of the things that she said was that Coetzee goes beyond Nagel with this notion of fullness of being. So it's not a matter of rules or principles, it's a matter of having a sense of the fullness of someone's life or of an animal's life. And so sometimes, don't we know people, and perhaps sometimes in ourselves, we treat others according to certain rules, but we don't really enter into their consciousness, their way of thinking. We don't imaginatively think of how they're experiencing things. And sometimes we can be cruel or unkind like that. So it's very, very relevant to that, I think, what you said.
I mean, just on that, and I had this thought as well during the Wednesday seminar, and this whole idea of what it's like to be a bat. And, for me, that's something that's fundamentally unknowable, and any approximation I make to trying to understand what it's like to be a bat will be a human projection. It'll be a subjective understanding of something else. So it will have my personhood in that. And I think when we try to understand other people, it's through our own sort of subjective lenses that we do so. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we know what it's like to be that other person, or that we know what it's like to be a bat. It's that we are projecting ourselves into something else, and that's not the same as actually knowing what it's like to be something else. And I wonder if that's ever really possible. And I think for me, that's why I found her arguments not very convincing. I don't know.
What about men? Do you have difficulty with men? Sorry.
Do I have difficulty with men? No. Yeah, I cannot imagine what it's like to be a man. No, I can't. I can't even imagine what it's like to be a woman.
Another woman.
Another woman, or
yes.
I don't see myself. Still see myself as a teenager. So.
So do we.
But I don't know.
Let me talk about the relationship between animal and human, because when I was a kid, I was taken to the London Zoo by my mother, and I was amazed how many animals are there. But the most surprising thing was there was a cage, and there was a words that this is the most dangerous animal in the world, and we can go inside the cage. And it was astonishing to me when I was a kid. So I tried to find the cage yesterday, and I've been there, but I couldn't find it because it was so huge. But I had new discovery there because there was a group of small children, and the guide of the zoo was explaining about the camel. And he was saying like this, look at these wonderful creatures. And I was surprised to hear the word creature because we don't have the word creature in Japanese. It means that everything is created by God. And I think the word creature have double meaning. One is that we are created by God, so we have the equality, everyone has right. But on the other hand, it is only human that recognize that we are created. So it's a different, we are different from animals. So I realized the double meaning of creature.
I was just thinking about the thing about reason and about the analysis that she says about animals, that animals don't have reason. And I think as human beings, I think reason is just understandable when we speak, when you communicate to the other, so you'll be able to reason to each other. And how do we know if to some extent the animals cannot reason as well? By the fact that they don't speak not in a way that we understand them. So I think she did not explore that much in terms of our language, how it would come about.
She does do that in a way, doesn't she, by the Red Peter example? Are you aware of the Red Peter background to this, the Kafka story? Yes, yes. So is that not sort of exploring this relationship between the animal and the human?
I think it's about this speech because here on page 121,
yes,
when she talks about the fact that animals lacking reason cannot understand the universe. So I think she ties reason to understanding, and not in terms of communicating that. It doesn't say about so reason is make understandable when we were able to communicate to each other using language to do so. And I think she, at least in this passage, she was trying to lock that with understanding only, not in communicating.
Do you think she's against reason or simply against a particular version of reason?
I don't think that she's totally against reason, but I think there is something that is more than that. There are other things that you can do in terms of how we understand the others, not just from reason, but you can use other human features. That's not in terms of when she later she talks about how you can like more or less put yourselves in someone else's shoes.
Yes.
Yeah, and the way she speaks about the Jews as well, how people killed other people without having the ability to put themselves in the other that had the blood and the flesh and the ashes being consumed.
Yes.
So
on page 132, there's a very good passage there. She says, too much of the way this is thought about is abstract. The horror is that the killers, the Nazis, the killers refused to think themselves into the place of their victims, as did everyone else. They said, it is they in those cattle trucks rattling past. I can't imagine myself there. So they didn't think that.
And just relating to something I said in the morning, I've seen a documentary a while ago, I don't know if it was Hannah Arendt, in which one of the Nazi that killed loads of people, he was taken to court and he was questioned why he was killing all these people, and he said, I was following orders, superior orders, and I was doing what was legal.
Yes, yes. And you referred to this earlier, didn't you? Didn't you refer to Hannah Arendt's writing? Yes, yeah.
Yes.
So he was following rules, he was following reason in a sense.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe reason something that is common to humans, but something that will detach us from each other if we don't consider other human features apart from reason.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But there are two ways you can describe it, aren't there? One, you could say that this is a debased, a bad version of reason, It's become too abstract, too technical. So we need a better version of reason, which includes putting ourselves into the shoes of the other, as you said. Okay, thank you. What's also relevant to what Marinette's just said is the passage that you, Maria, quoted, more or less, when at the end of her speech, someone says to her, or perhaps it's at the dinner, are you saying we should stop experiments with animals, even benign psychological experiments? Can you clarify? And she says in response, or she thinks in response, clarify. He's not a crazy after all. His mother could do, this is the son, his mother could do with some clarity. But, sorry, I think I've muddled it slightly, but this is the bottom of page 134. And the point is that there's a certain kind of reason that always asks for clarity. And that's like saying, put it into this box or into this box. Separate out things clearly. But as, of course, I was implying earlier on, very often we cannot separate things like that, and they shouldn't be separated, because if you separate them, you risk distorting them or limiting the ways in which you can think and respond. Okay. She says, in response to the man I've just referred to, page 135, line 7, I was hoping not to have to enunciate principles, his mother says. If principles are what you want to take away from this talk, I would have to respond, open your heart and listen to what your heart says. So when she says, open your heart, is that just a rational response? Is it just a woman's response?
I think we still have the separation, that is that dualism between reason and emotions, like they being opposite to each other. And and reason being someone that's superior to emotions, because emotions can maybe drive us to uncertainties, and reason would give us the clarity to think more objectively about things. And maybe what she's proposing is to stop this kind of dualism and put these two things to interact together, not having one overpowering the other.
Yes,
but
sure.
this as a complementary instead of opposing each other.
Okay.
Here is another thought about the reason. If people are made up from reason and emotions, what about babies? Because babies respond to instincts, and especially the first few days or weeks of their lives cannot rationalize, I think. So are they persons? Are they whole persons? Are they half persons? Are they closer to animals rather than persons? So again, by us accepting that a human is made by reason and emotions, it leaves me wondering, what about the babies?
Well, John McDowell, who contributed to the follow-up discussions of this text, John McDowell, the Pittsburgh philosopher, he refers to babies as in terms of mere animals that are becoming human. So that, in other words, they're like animals in terms of their behavior. They cannot operate beyond that level. And he puts the emphasis on this entry into language around, well, between 1 and 2, I suppose, as being the crucial thing that changes them. Now, of course, he doesn't mean that we therefore can treat babies like we treat other animals, but because the baby is becoming a human. But in terms of its capacities at that time, he sees them as animals. But others have disagreed with that. And actually, there's a discussion that will be in the Journal of Philosophy of Education in February, that follows this up exactly, with a man called Sebastian Rödel contributing. He disagrees with McDowell. But I'm sorry, that's a digression maybe. Does anybody want to say more in response to Maria? So Maria's question is, what is it that constitutes the human? Because a biologist will tell you it's a particular kind of physique and so on. But the biologist's account is only good enough for biology. Clearly, by human being, we mean, no, it's good enough for biology and medicine in various ways. I'm not being negative about biology, but it's a mistake to think that the biological account is the fundamental one. Biology is good, but it's an abstraction from our experience, as other sciences are. To understand the human, we need something more rounded. And it's a profound question. It's Hamlet's question. Hamlet in the play says, what a piece of work is man? In other words, what is it to be a human being? What is a human being? In some ways like a god, in some ways like an animal. This strange intermediate state. What is human life? And that's very close to what you're talking about. What constitutes the human being?
A soul. So living energy?
Living entity.
Living energy. Energy?
Energy,
Yeah.
yes.
And I think value, I found the literature, it's saying energy.
Energy,
Yeah.
okay. All right.
Can I respond to Maria?
Mm.
Okay, and I don't think babies are animals because I gave birth to babies for 3 times and I raised them for years. So when they're just born, but when they're sleeping, they smiles. And the psychologists say that they smile automatically, but we read their expression that, oh, they're showing love towards us, to the parents, so we give back them our love. So some kind of emotion is already embedded in our body program or something like that. This is the standpoint from biology, but I felt that babies are not animals.
But you're not just speaking for biology there, because biology would talk about physical responses, but to say emotion already takes us into another territory, like we were talking about earlier on today. So it involves certain beliefs about them, that they're to be cherished and cared for and loved.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
It got closer to the argument of Nussbaum.
Yes, okay. So would somebody like to talk about universality? I guess this relates to the nature of reason, doesn't it? Whether reason is abstract and universal.
It comes from a French philosopher Levinas, and he says in the reason of universality there is no singularity, and we have the reason because we give up the singularity. That's what he says in his book Totality and Infinity. I think that's a quite good sentence to understand this such sort of rationality, because in some circumstance this universality makes human to become an agent of some sort of force or some and
abstract principle?
Yes,
Yes.
abstract
Yes,
principle,
okay.
and you are not anymore individual or anymore so
Can I interrupt you there, because you use the word singularity, which is not a very common word, and sometimes it's contrasted with individuals. So John Rawls's philosophy is about generating abstract rules in order to make better lives for individuals. So we can do all of this in the third person. We can talk about what ought to be the case for human beings in general. But the idea of singularity is that you stop thinking in the first person, not to think selfishly, but to think of the weight of responsibility that comes to you. And I said some of this on Wednesday, for those of you who were there. But so if you do something wrong, then of course many people do something wrong. So you just check what you've done against what all those others are, and you get a fair judgment of it. But in reality, it's not like that, is it? Because if you've done something bad in your life, you feel that remorse, that regret about what you've done. And if someone else is feeling that, well, you think it's their problem, it's not you. But when you've done something wrong, even if your friends comfort you and reassure you, you still feel this weight of responsibility. So no one else has done exactly this thing that you do. You are singularized in that responsibility. You are the one who did it, at least on this occasion, and you can't undo it. So that's what being singularized means. Being called out as you are, but you can't pass this on to someone else. But carry on with what you're saying, please.
Oh, well, I think it's
but it went into Japanese thought as well. Perhaps that's Jeremy. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure.
With the microphone, perhaps.
Yeah, our group just started discussing this question of rationality and what it is, and Shusan started with the point that that all human beings have rationality, and so I asked the question: do all systems of rationality demand universality? Another way to put that would be: do forms of rationality always require a universal, a kind of essential point to stabilize the whole system? Or is it possible to have a non-essential center to a system of rationality?
Could I say something there? If you go to Japan and go into a park, when you go into the gate, there's a little map, like there is in many parks here. If you go into a park here, there's a north-south orientation always. It's always put up that way. So the north-south orientation that we have, Eurocentric, but is related to an absolute principle. Whereas when you go into the park in Japan, it starts from wherever you are. So if you come in at the north end, then the north will be here and you have points going that way. If you come in the south end, the south will be here and go that way. And it's very, to me, it's quite disorienting when you first do that, but probably it's the other way around for those of you who are Japanese. But that I think is relevant to what you said, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Yeah.
And I pose it a different way, whether Japanese rationality has the absolute point and the drive for universality. But I don't know if it's a good way to go, because some people will ignore the Japanese system, if there is such a thing.
Yes. Doesn't Watsuji's book, Fudo, doesn't that deal with this too? Yes.
Could you give an example? Sorry, just because I'm finding it kind of, maybe because I'm so existentialist, but I don't know. But could you give an example? Is that really
help me give an example?
Putting you on the spot? Sorry.
That the rules of what counts as rational are generated by the relationships rather than by an absolute point.
That would be Japanese thought.
I mean, if I have to say it, I would say Japanese thought.
Okay.
But if I had to say it a different way, I'd say that Western thought seems to place that universal axis point, like Paul said, at north-south, or let's say linear time, Newton. There's always some type of absolute that has to be in place, and then the whole system of rationality evolves out of it.
Okay.
But because of that system of rationality demands, it drives towards universality. But I wonder if we can imagine here in London a system that doesn't require the absolute.
To what Jeremy has said, I think the point is not, in the idea of universality, probably the goal, where the goal is quite important, but in, let's say Japanese context, probably, sorry, what was your question? Your question was, what I wanted to say was, like, I think Paul has mentioned, or Jeremy also has, the logos is how to say, one definition of logos in Japanese is do, the process, the way. Is that you who mentioned Paul? Sure, so maybe the emphasis is on the side. The process. So whether or not where the end is located is not so much important, probably. Not so much the issue. Whereas in Western philosophy, traditionally, or at least in ancient idea, there is always some goal, universal.
Yes.
I don't know if my...
No, that's very helpful. Can I just suggest something too? That if you think about logos, then think about it in kind of Western contemporary terms, then one way to think about it is a kind of abstract grid that must be there. You know, a rigid logic that must underlie things. And that is exactly the way that philosophers such as Bertrand Russell started to think of things. Timothy Williamson was thinking like that the other week when he spoke to us. But another way to think of logos is also as the way, which is what Nami's been saying. So reason is not something static. Reason is tied to the word. The two go together, don't they? Reason and word in logos. And that's moving, that's dynamic. And I think it also relates to the thing I showed you before, the picture of the Van Gogh, where things are moving, they're not static. Does anybody else want to say anything before we pause for a coffee break? Is that all right? So we'll leave this one here, and by tomorrow I'd like you to think about Norma and think about her name, please. Okay, I'd like to talk about Norma a little bit and about her name. And while you're about it, you can also think of the name of the town where this university is. I don't know if you remember what it is, but you just have a look. I don't mean Waltham, you can think about that, but there's another name there as well. Do you remember? Appleton. So just think about that for tomorrow, okay?